Hi, I'm Mandy McKay. I'm a professional artist and I'm making these videos to give you tips to help enhance your creativity. And you don't have to be an artist or a professional artist. You can just be starting out with a creative hobby, and these tips should be useful for anybody at any level. One thing that I think is the biggest hindrance to most people's creativity is a fear of failure, essentially, and just making stuff that isn't very good. And especially if you're just starting out, this really will get in the way of being creative. And I've actually done a few videos already about this. I have a different tip for each video. I have really a lot of tips that are basically ways to get over this fear of failure. And instead of making just one really long video with a bunch of tips, I'm doing a separate video for each one. And then that way, if one of them really seems to resonate with you, then it'll be easier to refer back to it. A few that I've done already, let's see, there's one about not censoring yourself when you're coming up with ideas. There's also giving yourself permission to make mistakes. And a recent video that I did is to ask yourself, what is the absolute worst way that I could do this project? So today's tip is a little bit different than that. It's actually a lot different, but it will sound similar to you. And this is to create something that is intentionally bad. Now, how does this differ from asking yourself, what's the absolute worst way that I can do something? Well, really, when you ask yourself, what's the absolute worst way, that's during the ideas phase, and creating something that's actually bad is in the execution phase. So if you want to refer back to my video about what's the absolute worst way to do something, you'll get a better explanation there for that tip. The example that I used in that video, I'll go ahead and use it again in this video. But I used the example of, let's say you're a baker and you want to come up with a birthday cake and you want it to be something really different and new. So with asking yourself, what is the absolute worst way that I could bake this cake? I use the example of adding tuna to the cake. And obviously, I think that's not going to really work. You can refer to that video to see how I talk about coming up with this terrible idea can give you some good ideas. For this video, for making something that's actually bad, the example of making the birthday cake, it might be intentionally burning the cake. Now, that is a bit wasteful of resources. I will go ahead and say that. If you were actually doing this birthday cake example, maybe you would do just a small cupcake. It seems really tragic to waste a bunch of food like that, and I think you could still get the point of the exercise just making a small cupcake. The same goes for if you're a painter. I've done this exercise before. I'm predominantly an oil painter, and I did a couple paintings that were maybe a foot tall so that I didn't just use up a giant canvas or anything for this exercise. If you're a poet or a songwriter or something like that, then you're probably not going to be using a lot of resources at all. I actually do this exercise a lot myself, but in a small form. As I said, I'm mostly an oil painter, but I have an ideas notebook and I'll write down different ideas that I have for upcoming paintings, for future paintings, and I'll do little thumbnail sketches, and they're just like an inch or two high, and I intentionally make them terrible, just so that it can help me the way that this exercise is meant to help anybody. So come up with a way that if you were going to do your art, your creative practice, that you would go ahead and make something and you decide from the beginning, this is going to be intentionally bad. And then you see what you come up with. Now, what can you expect from actually doing this exercise? Well, the first thing is, of course, the whole purpose is that this is meant to get you past your fear of failure. And if you just start out doing something and you know that it's going to be terrible, it can be really freeing. And you can focus on enjoying the process instead of worried about what the end result can be. So that's the biggest takeaway from doing this exercise. Now, some other things, well, you might notice that once you've done this really bad art, it might make you a little less critical and judgmental of your actual work where you're making an effort. And you may see that really your work isn't that bad at all. You'll start to recognize some good things about it, hopefully. And it is possible, this is not the point of the exercise, but it is possible that there will actually be something useful that you can glean from, that you can use in your future art from having made something bad. Whether it's like a better understanding of just what not to do, or maybe maybe it is actually something that you thought was bad, but you can put a little twist on it and it will be good. When I did this years ago with a painting and doing an intentionally bad painting, it relied on having just a really terrible composition. There are some different rules of composition for design purposes, and I intentionally broke them. And the painting turned out that it was still pretty bad, but a lot of good art has to do with breaking the rules, and so does a lot of creativity. And I've actually utilized this bad composition technique that I came across from doing this exercise. Now, one other thing that you might notice is that it's actually pretty hard to make something that is truly bad. So if you do this exercise, don't be surprised if you come up with something that's really just mediocre and not truly terrible. It is much harder than you think, and really takes probably a lot of skill to make something that is really that bad. But just give it a shot. Try to take whatever kind of project you've been working on and just do maybe a small version of it, and just try to do something that is intentionally bad. And hopefully you will find it very freeing and helpful for the future, and getting you past that fear of failure that is just so stifling to creativity. So I hope you liked this video and found it helpful. Again, my name is Manda McKay, and thank you so much for watching.